law has to do with the crisis of housing, or the crises of housing, which we can think of in a lot of different ways, but it's certainly two. It's the problem of access and the problem of affordability. And law is directly implicated in both of those crises. And I thought, given the focus of these conversations around organizing and sort of orienting, like sort of what are we fighting for and how do we achieve it, I wanted to talk just a little bit about a model, an international model that if you talk to any housing nerd, like within 5 minutes, they would probably mention Vienna and social housing in Vienna and sort of how that emerged and some of the what we can learn from that experience. And because I also think that it reveals sort of the path that we took is revealing in sort of why we're facing the problems that we experience, not just that we read about, but also all of us have a place to live or need a place to live. And so we all have expertise in our own way, even if we have not worked directly in housing organizing. So, after this, just a little bit of history, I'll be relatively brief. But in Vienna today, about 40% of residents live in social housing, either directly provided by the state or through nonprofit entities that are sort of organized through the state. And that's a very different, creates very different experience for renters. We have stability, also with respect to price, like home prices, rents, and also access. And this relates to this a crisis that emerged after the First World War, and you had a system of housing that in many ways resembles what New York is experiencing right now. So you had luxury development that was unaffordable to most, and you had housing provision at the low end, which is like tenement housing. And the Social Democratic Party won this election on a platform that directly came out of organizing around this issue. And they, over a period of years, accumulated about a third of the land in Vienna and redirected much of that towards the purpose of social housing. And so I think I was thinking about how, we can talk about what we can learn from that model as sort of like policy, but I do think that like what's interesting is that even if in the US, in New York, we were able to organize kind of that political will for something like that, law is an obstacle to achieving those ends for a number of reasons. So one, in the US, unlike virtually every other wealthy country, local goods are funded through the local tax base. And what that means is that suburbanization, jurisdictional fragmentation, and white flight all have direct and very consequential effects for local government's ability to fund public goods, including housing. And so you have the fragmentation of the tax base. This very much handicaps like political will from elected leaders, including those who run on progressive platforms, because there's this constant fear of mobile, like of capital flight, whether that's corporate wealth, housing wealth. That all puts a severe constraint on the ability of political actors to respond to these crises. You have state law that restricts every local government's ability to tax the wealth that still remains in the jurisdiction. And then also local governments in the US are responsible for responding to problems that are created by failures of the federal government, by the absence of social guarantees. All of that makes this sort of program much more difficult than it would otherwise be. And the path that we took instead, facing a similar crisis in the Great Depression, is directly responsible. So the law that sort of created all of those obstacles, instead of directly providing housing, as was done, for example, in Vienna, and not only Vienna, but it's a good example, Instead, the United States decided to rely on the provision of private credit backed by guarantees, but only by the federal government guarantees, but only for white families and only for, primarily for the purchase of single family homes. So what that does is it directly results in suburbanization and sprawl, which is directly responsible for the exit of white wealth from places like New York and other metros areas around the country. And then it also is responsible for the wealth gap, or is partly responsible for the wealth gap that again comes back into that has consequences for housing right now. So right now, when you see mid-career professionals making purchases of housing in a place like New York, a lot of that money is inherited wealth that is racialized directly because of the law and legal choices or political choices that we've made. So all of these things kind of come back around. They structure the current crisis, but they also put a limitation in many ways on the possibilities for organizing, or I shouldn't say they put a limit, but they make it that much harder. And so I just we can, talk more about that, but I wanted to sort of use the kind of have not taken as a way of understanding why we're facing the crises that we face right now.
Thank you, Brian. I agree with many of the things Brian said, but I come with a little bit of a different perspective, being of African American descent, and how people that look like me were treated in this country, right? Housing was racialized in this country, redlining, some of the things that you all know, familiar terms you heard. And a lot of times when I develop my theories on this stuff, it's from lived experience. So I think about my dad moving my family from Brooklyn, New York in 1962 to Freeport, Long Island. And when my dad moved, my mom and dad first went to look at the house, they were discriminated against by a real estate broker, right? And once they got to Freeport and went to the broker's office, the broker told them somebody put a down payment on the house, and the house is probably going to be purchased by that particular family. My mother was a little upset. My dad didn't want to make trouble, but my mother convinced my dad to send one of his white coworkers the following week out to Long Island. And sure enough, that real estate broker asked if my dad's white coworker wanted to put a down payment on the house, right? I didn't know this at the time, but this is, as I look back at my family's history. Then the other thing I think that happened is predatory lending, right? My dad was always stressed out about the mortgage, right? He was freaking out at the dinner table about the mortgage, and he worked 18 hours a day. Probably got a predatory loan is my best guess, looking back at it. And then, so I've developed theories now when I think about home ownership, I think it's sort of a farce, right? We've been led to believe that it's going to lead to wealth, right? Home ownership is going to lead to wealth. I make the argument that it leads to perpetual debt. And it starts with the way that you acquire a home, right? You have to go into debt to get a credit rating so you can go deeper into debt to buy a home, which you're going to continually pay off in Long Island, in Freeport, Long Island. When my dad and I finally sold the house because it fell into my hands. Taxes were $11,000 a year for a lot of the reasons that you explained around the tax basis, suburban tax basis, support the schools. So for about 25 years, my dad and my brother were living in that house. Nobody's going to school, but they're paying $11,000. The roof starts to go. You got to come up with $80,000. So then the financial crisis comes, and all the wealth is sucked out of the home. But I do think government is complicit in a lot of different ways. And Brian did a lot to talk about social housing. I want to talk a little bit about public housing. It was once the true social safety net for poor people in this country, right? It was created, and for many years, Ed Ott, who I talked about, was on the panel with me, grew up in public housing. Sonia Sotomayor, one of our Supreme Court justices, lived in public housing. But during the Reagan administration, there was a decision by the government that we're going to get out of the housing business. And it started systemic disinvestment in public housing. Then it fell into a shaded disrepair. It started blaming it on the people that lived there. Look how these people are living, but you're not doing capital improvements. Elevators start working, leaks start, the roof starts leaking. There are a lot of problems. So in 1986, the the federal government funded public housing to the degree of $85 billion a year. Today, it's a little less than 30 billion that the government puts into public housing. It's gone down significantly from the 80s and continues to drop. The government wants to wash their hands of public housing. That's problematic. I do think here in New York, we've been blessed that there's 500,000 people living in public housing. You can't fucking take it down like you've done around the rest of the country, because where do you put 500,000 people? You got a bigger problem than you ever wanted to deal with, right? It's fallen in a lot of other cities, but we've always had the largest concentration of public housing in the country in New York City, and I think it still stands tall. And I think one of the proudest moments for me when I look at public housing is the Red Hook houses that overlooks New York Harbor, and how the hell that no developer was able to clean those houses and really build some luxury towers there overlooking New York Harbor. Because the fight, organizing, people organized in the Red Hook houses and fought back. And I think you see a lot of rich organizing going on in New York City. I also think that, you've seen this happen in different cities. Brian mentioned Flint, and I want to talk a little bit about human rights. Our country is based on civil law, right? And I don't want to discredit anything that happened during the civil rights era, but I'm a believer in human rights versus civil rights. What are those rights afforded to me because I'm a human being? Our civil law is based on the Constitution, which is 250 years old. And I have this conversation with a lot of law schools around the country, and I think it's problematic. I work in places like Brazil and South Africa. Brazil has a constitution written in post-dictatorship in 1985 that says land has to serve a social function. It has to be growing food or housing people. Looks a lot different than making private property a commodity for a select few. South Africa's constitution, written in 1996, post-apartheid, guarantees the human right to a home. A little bit harder to actualize it, but it's in that constitution. So you have a leg to stand on. We don't have that here. I also think our constitution is flawed from the time that it was written. We the people it starts off with. So I ask, who are those people? Because people that look like me were considered 3/5 of a man. You weren't even human. So our Constitution is flawed from the time it was created. And it needs to change, but there's such resistance to changing it. And I think we have to organize ourselves and say, and it may take a revolution. I'm not promoting violence, but I think at some point, this country needs to rise up. And I'm afraid that we're a little hesitant to rise up, because I thought the perfect time was 2009, when the Obama administration took your tax money and said, I'm going to give it to these big banks because it's okay for you to fail, Brian. These big banks can't fail, right? And then those banks started foreclosing and giving us some bracket numbers, right? And what's so bizarre about buying a home? You have to buy an insurance policy through the federal government that's going to guarantee that you pay off the mortgage. Well, Mr. Banker just evicted me. He got the house, and he got his mortgage paid off by the federal government. Profiting twice, man. Capitalism is a bitch, man. We need to understand how the system works. So there's a lot of layers to this whole thing that I think needs to be looked at. And where Raúl comes from, the New Economy Project, talks a lot about this stuff. And, over the years, I've worked closely with New Economy Project, and it's just a different way of thinking. I also inform my fellow panelists that every Friday morning, I'm blessed to sit down with a progressive economist who is a visiting scholar at this school, Richard Wolff. And we have coffee every Friday morning to solve all the economic problems in the world, man. So, I think we have to think outside of the box. What can we do different? Because the system isn't working for us, it's working against us.
Thank you both very much. Certainly a lot of consistency. We see a lot of nodding. Here's some snapping. That's great. So I do want to pick up a little bit on the organizing point that you made and we get into issues of control, sort of who's in charge here. You talked a little bit about social housing, you talked about public housing, and people are fighting for both of those things. As you alluded to briefly, Rob, there are also people in New York who are fighting for a new economy model, community land trusts being a big part of that. The idea being that folks collectively take land off the market in order to build housing. Sometimes easier said than done, but we do have green just around the street here, and a Barrio Trust, which was a long, hard slog up in East Harlem for many, many years. So we have a lot of different sort of pockets of organizing. Rob, I'm wondering if you can hit a little bit about the story, what's going on in New York, who are the heroes, who are the villains, are there heroes, are there villains? And then Brian, you can bring this a little bit back out into policy, public finance, like how the machine is running in the back of the room and how that figures into organizing as well. And then we'll go to a short break and then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, so thank you, Raul. I think we look at this through two lenses, right? Right after the financial crisis, you started hearing people talk about housing as a human right. I didn't know if they believed in it. It seemed more like a slogan at the time in 2009, 2010. I was doing the work of Take Back the Land, which was an answer to the foreclosure crisis at that time. We would find houses that were foreclosed by a bank or a government agency where a family was evicted. We'd break in them, move the families back in there, and defend their rights to be in there using international human rights law and standards. We challenged particularly Bank of America, and one of our demands for Bank of America was to put these foreclosed houses into a community land trust. It was the education I got from Peter Marcuse, who took his class for 1 year and taught us to Take Back the Land, how to create a community land trust. So it was a relationship between academia and the social justice world and people in communities, which when I came into social justice organizing, so you can't work with academia, you can't work with these policy folks, and I think I've been blessed, and I think many others have been blessed to have a relationship with some of those groups at that time. When we were doing the work of Take Back the Land, our legal partner, our strategic legal partner, was the Center for Constitutional Rights here in New York. Every time Bank of America or some big bank called us and wanted to negotiate with us, said, we don't want to talk to you. We're going to keep breaking in these houses and moving families back in. You want to have a conversation with us, you speak to our strategic partner. We trust them. We don't trust you, right? And I think that's part of the organizing model. But over a period of time, I think we've had public education and public, what I call popular and political education, and people started forming and thinking outside of the box. So community land trust model became popular in between 2010 and today. We have two big groups in New York, the New York City Community Land Initiative. There's the East Harlem El Barrio Land Trust. I happen to be on the board of Cooper Square, which is a land trust that was, it came out of struggle in the, going back to the 60s. And it is successful. It's on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and I think that is pulling a piece of land out of the corporate market or the commodity market and giving it to a community in perpetuity. It allows you to do a lot of things. The community governs that land. You can build cooperative housing, mutual housing on top of it. There's many things you can do with it. But I also think there are challenges to that model, right? Cooper Square was a protracted struggle over 50 years. And as these groups were forming, I kept arguing with these groups saying, if this is such a successful model, how come there aren't more of them? And one of the things I love to talk about is you have to be real sometimes. And I asked this question, who is going to give you a piece of land in fucking Manhattan in perpetuity? Ain't nobody, because you can go straight up, right? It is a difficult process. So we have to think outside of the box. Where can we go around the city to create a land trust? At one time, there were 85 acres of public land out in the Rockaways, and I kept arguing with our social movements. I know we concentrate on grabbing that land. It's public land, it's our land, right? We have to think different. So I think there are opportunities, but there are some obstacles in the way, right? We recently had a chief housing officer in New York. I don't know if you guys know the name Jessica Katz. And I think Jessica Katz and I worked together for about 15 years on something called the Continuum of Care, which oversees about $150 million that comes into New York City from HUD for housing plus services. It's called McKinney-Vento funding. But Jessica, as she became chief housing officer, she wanted people with lived experience inside the city hall being part of the decision-making process. So she reached out to me early on in her tenure as chief housing officer, and I had to thinking, okay, I got my foot in the door of City Hall. My job is to kick the door open and bring in the rest of the community, right? And so we had some very fruitful conversations, but we quickly saw that this mayor was an obstacle to making real change with respect to housing. You know, as many of our elected officials are in New York, they are in the pockets of developers. Developers contribute to these campaigns, and when they contribute to your campaigns, you make decisions based on what those developers want. Tish James once said when she was a council member, oil is to Texas as development is to New York as oil is to Texas, right? And it lets you know about some of the challenges. And she was very involved as a council member around that arena being built in Brooklyn. And even though she lost, I was standing next to Tish James at a bar called Freddy's in that area up to the last minute. We knew we lost, but she was defiant, man. She was really speaking out against that arena. And, you know, you come to see over a period of time that a lot of promises made while that deal was connected didn't become a reality. You know, so what kind of jobs came of it? Pitching peanuts at a fucking Nets game for $4, you know, for 4 hours a night. It's not a real job, man. It's a lot of bullshit. So we need to understand that we need to challenge that electoral power. I can't stand electoral politics, but we have to get involved. We have to make what I call political links. I'll give you a perfect example. When Jessica first got into City Hall, she called a meeting together with all these folks with lived experience. So anybody who's who, Gary Jenkins was at DSS at the time, commissioner, Adolfo Carrion is in the room, anybody, Deputy Mayor Isom, all in the room. So they asked us to go around the table and introduce ourselves. And they come to me and I said, before I give you my name and tell you why I'm here, I want to tell you why I'm here. And Jessica was standing in the back corner. And I said, I'm here because I have a lot of respect and trust in that woman. I know how she thinks, and I know she's good for our communities. If you want to build a relationship with me, you're gonna have to build some trust with me. Mayor, he comes over and he puts his hands on my shoulder and goes, we're gonna be okay. And I look at him in front of everybody and I said, that remains to be seen. Then I introduce myself, right? So you set a tone, right? This is not bullshit. I'm not up in there for a photo op. I'm not about that. Every time they ended those meetings, they were in the corner taking a picture. I'm not coming for the picture. I'm not here for that bullshit. I'm here to make real social change. And I think that's the message that we have to get across to people. We have to push in a direction. And then we have to get people in office that think the way we do. We've done a good job on the state level. Our city council is in a good shape. Mostly women, mostly progressive women. There are two people that are sitting in state government. Marcella Montañez from Sunset Park is somebody I've been out in the street and in the trenches with, and Jabari Brisbane, it's the same thing. These are real organizers that come from the community and understand what the community needs and wants. But we have to get more people into office like that.
That's incredible. I'm going to kind of return to some of the, one of the points I was making earlier, about the obstacles that are faced even by very progressive, city councils, for example, that whose membership has been deeply shaped by movements, electoral movements in the city here and elsewhere, that are again structured by law. So just a very quick kind of story that I think about a lot from, some of the work that I was doing before my academic, my PhD, was a campaign to make prison phone calls free in the state of Connecticut. Incredibly expensive, incredibly harmful for both those who are incarcerated and their families. Extremely well documented, all of the harms that came from this, and basically we, working with a number of incredible organizers, were having conversations with members of the state legislature, and they always took essentially the same form, which was something to the effect of, we hear you, we agree, however, we're getting $8 million a year from this contract with a private vendor, And if we make these phone calls free, we don't have the money in the budget. And so it's like, so I started thinking about, seeing the connections to, between public finance and the obstacles that at both the city level and even the state level, to direct public provision, that are again created by law, that make it very difficult, including for, we've been talking about community land trust. One of the hardest things, and ongoing campaigns is focused on, it's the initial acquisition of the land. That is really placing an obstacle on sort of how widely this model could spread. And so a lot of the ongoing campaigns in New York and elsewhere are focused on repurposing land that's already owned by the city. There's an incredible campaign right now that's I think it's the East Brooklyn Community Land Trust that is trying to take parking lots for the NYPD and converting that into community land trusts. Really exciting work. But beyond the land that the city already owns, which, by the way, it faces a lot of financial incentives to sell it off to developers instead as an alternative. Courts have interpreted our Constitution to require, even in the use of eminent domain, just compensation for private owners. And so all of these do come back to the sort of fiscal pressures that local governments are experiencing. And that's true of the community land trust model. That's true of social housing. But what connects all of these, and sort of the way that I find it sometimes helpful, they are different models: public housing, social housing, community land trust, other alternatives. Rent stabilization. There's lots of different. We can maybe in Q&A we can talk about some of these policy options. But basically, at a high level, all of these are efforts in some way to remove housing from to decommodify housing, and to disconnect housing access and affordability from the need from wealth and from wage income, to make it such that housing is a human right. That we can think in those terms, and that the world can look that way.
I just want to, if I could just follow up something that you said. I think when it comes to eminent domain, right, it's a process that's what created that arena in Brooklyn. We need to understand this community.
Do you mind just saying what eminent domain is?
Yeah, so eminent domain is a way of acquiring a piece of land or an area of land by our government because it's for the good of the community, right? We're going to take this land and we're going to give you just compensation because it's for the good of community to build this arena for this private owner that owns a basketball team. It's fucking bizarre, right? But we never unpack stuff like that. But there was a mayor out in San Jose, California during the foreclosure crisis. Yeah, I think it's Gail Goodrich, I believe was her name. And she had talked about using eminent domain to claim foreclosed houses from banks. Man, and the developers got together and put money in and ran her ass out of office, man. They were so afraid of her, right? But, sometimes we have to, this is something I say as an organizer in communities all the time. Data can work for you or against you, right? It's how you use it and how it's used for its purpose. So in communities, when we hear about data, we think about surveillance. I think data tells stories, sets trends, right? And that's what got me into homelessness, right? You would blame the individual because he's a failure, but when you have the data that says certain obstacles were in the way of this person, it changes all of the narratives. So we have to understand that we have to push back on the system that is pushing down on us, but that comes from popular and political education. And one of the reasons why I spend so much time outside of the US is, especially in a place like Brazil, the landless workers movement in Brazil has their own school. And he said to me, Rob, every time you come to Sao Paulo, stop by the school, even though I went through the 6-week course twice. He said, come by the school, even if you spend a half an hour, because you're going to learn something that you didn't know prior to coming here. And I think, when you think like that, people born into challenges like that, they organize themselves, it's a lot different. So I think one of the things that we're lacking here is good political and popular education on an ongoing basis, think that would change our situation, focus a little bit.
Thank you, Rob. That's an excellent note to lead into a break. I'll just quickly make a comment, that, you know, our discussion here has been necessarily limited. Hopefully we get to more topics in conversation, or we can stay with these in depth. I mean, we talk about ways of pushing back, and, you know, there's there's permanent debate amongst organizers and how much time to allot to certain things. Building project, this is a fighting back project, this is a campaign, this is a policy thing, what's going on. You mentioned eminent domain and its use in California, it's potentially used in California, Rob, which, you know, I forgot, thinking back, I was in California at the time when they tried to do this in San Jose and Stockton, Richmond.
Yeah.
Actually working on mortgage policy, now that I think of it. And it was very exciting, but I think it also showed some of the limits of the law and the use of the courts, because it didn't actually, you know, wind up playing out like that. So you have to choose which institutions you're sort of challenging, where the levers are, power, et cetera. And then we talk about development and finance and you know, the power that the developers have over you know, the political institutions, especially here in the city. And we're talking about layers. It's not an accident that we have this housing situation in the same city as Wall Street, right? And we didn't hit on it so much in you know, in this session, but in other LPE housing events, they're all a different flavor. We've got people from different backgrounds. We talk a lot about anti-eviction work and tenants unions and, you know, what to do on that front. And immediately what's happening, what do we do about the fires right now? And that conversation goes, you know, to who owns the land. And then that becomes a question of, do we have the data to know who owns the land? Maybe we don't, and we think it's BlackRock, but no one can prove that. So, you know, we're stuck and all these problems are in a big loop. So there's lots to think about here. I think now we take 5 minutes or.
Yeah, just take a 5 minute break, because, you know, just think about questions, talk to the person next to you, it's always good to have a conversation going, and then in about 5 minutes, we start the Q&A. Okay?
Which intercept one way. So yeah, and it has to overlap. People have to say, you know, people keep saying to me, like, they should bring that electric, but I can't stomach it. So it's not the place for me. The place for me is down on the steps of City Hall. As I told Mayor Adams that day in City Hall, I prefer to be downstairs challenging you to do the job you want. Like, he freaked out when he.
Had some fun conversations.
Yeah, you know, listen, you can't be afraid. And, you know, it's something I learned by that I've been exposed to. Like David Formby, and all these guys, and David in this very room. Me and David going at it. I don't know why the students are like, holy shit. You know, but, you know, he thought differently. And I'm like, hey, you're a Marxist theorist, and you're saying you like material shit, you know, come on, man. So,
Yeah, John Whitlow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know John. The CUNY Law School has been, so a great story during Occupy. Look when they marched over the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
So 700 people get arrested, right? And lawyers, legal, so everybody came from every corner. I go into the Nesre, it was called Partners for Degree Rights. It's called Nesre. At the executive director, law school, law school. I'm gonna rip the lawyers, bill, and all my legal services, and more ask me, because I've been asking them my house and help all this time. I know 700 kids in our church, they ran to the defense. It's easy, alienate yourself. So I think John gave the space, and the Buster City Silver was on our board at Nesbitt at the time, we gave the space. And before you know it, there was thousands of that fine, so what are they doing? And those lawyers want to come in and ask me the question, what do you need? Now, there's no shortage. Housing.
I can see this thing, it just came over. We're on the same, right? I mean, this will kill everyone, right? National, I mean, we're basically screwed because, right, the whole financial system is essentially like, what a good idea to keep spending money over it. And because you organize locally, you can't touch this. Right? And it's so, and anything you do in Washington, you can't even get to them. They don't even exist. They, you know, really since the end of the crisis, if you don't take letters, it goes to like, so use it. It actually so and maybe they get now, maybe they don't, I don't know, but to try to get momentum, you gotta get like, then you gotta get on national television.
Well, even national television, join some of the national groups, because some of the national groups, National Low Income Housing Coalition, Get Access,
So that, yeah.
National Alliance to End
But it's like,
Homelessness.
but you know, I just feel like there's also a problem, don't mind me, I'm something now, but I really, because you guys are great. To find the kind of people that are considered to have credentials, they're being to find the news outlets that are amenable to it. Now we see even like Capitol Police bunch of it shut down, right? The reporters are like the smart reporters, they're like, yeah, put it down.
I don't know if the media is the way to go. I think, you know, we had the opportunity to create our own media, our own stories.
Keep going. I just thought I'd throw that in there.
No problem. Thank you.
Hi, it's Sanjay Chune. Just raise your hand and come here to the mic with the recording thing, so. And you'll ask questions. I'll go to the back.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your work and everything and bringing it here. I really appreciate everything you have to share with us. And I was curious, as someone with data science skills, how can I get involved specifically with a lot of anger about what's going on? And you talk about the revolution, and I'm with you. So how do we as like data science skilled people get involved in a way that's impactful?
So we can talk immediately after this. One of the things I hold close to my heart is working with young folks in the city who have technical skills. So one of the people who graduated from the program that I teach in, Design and Urban Ecologies, her name is Mano Vigerio. And Mano has a lot of data skills, and she started a chapter of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project here in New York City. Then there's the Housing Data Coalition, which is made up of technical folks who really, I get a kick out of it because New York City has something called an open data portal that has a lot of information in it, but it's useless to the naked eye like you and me. But those data scientists go in there and they come back to the social justice groups and go, yo, Rob, there's all this good stuff in here. What do you know a group that needs this or needs that? And they work with community-based organizations to organize that stuff. And I make the argument, that's how we got the right to counsel law passed. Those two groups working with 10 organizing groups around the city to go into that open data portal, pull shit out of there, and organizing in a way that it made sense to the groups that were doing the work.
Can you say what the right to counsel?
Sure. Right to counsel is a law, so we have a law that was passed in 2017 that says you have a right to counsel when you go into housing court now. That wasn't always true. Just like in criminal court, you're allowed a defense attorney. Well, now in housing court, which is a civil court action, you have a right to counsel. This law was passed in 2017. It was working on a few select zip codes at a time and being rolled out gradually, but in 2019, it was rolled out citywide. It's not perfect because legal services is not being funded the way it should be funded, and they don't have enough attorneys. But we have seen results that it is making a huge difference with the results of housing courts.
Yeah, I would just echo all of that, and as sort of a specific example, of this, well, the one specific plug I would make is, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to use like data analysis and expertise in this space. But mapping, geographic information system and other ways of mapping is so incredibly helpful for these fights. And sort of one example of this is this they call it a black paper. This is what I was referring to earlier. This proposal to convert the NYPD parking spots into social housing through community land trusts. What they did, and it's in this like incredible document, is they worked with folks who had data analysis expertise to identify these parking spaces that were unnecessary for the NYPD, and they had a whole way of explaining how they arrived at these results and then identify that. And it's been very powerful, but and it was sort of a way of directly like channeling anger in these communities that came out of not only frustration, deep frustration around housing access and affordability, but also was connected, of course, to the fights around abolition, police violence, and brutality. And so I think that's just like a really good sort of case study for how like technical expertise can be helpful for social movements.
It's interesting that Brian brought up mapping. So Manal and the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project didn't have office space. So I worked for a human rights office. I'm a senior advisor for a group called Partners for Dignity and Rights that had an office in the financial district. Most of the staff was working remotely, so I had this 14-desk office for myself. So I would give them meeting space. And the very first map they created and posted up on the wall, they showed where evictions were the worst and where they were concentrated. And just like every other social injustice in New York, the South Bronx. That's right. It's the same as the dark areas with the South Bronx. Food insecurity, health injustice, all this shit. So really, mapping is important, but the community-based organizations don't have that skill set. And sometimes it is a challenge, I'm gonna be honest, to bring students like yourself into a community-based organization, because a lot of times it's pushback from that community, well, I can't supervise students. Students got a skill set, man. You better sit down and talk to these folks, And I'm gonna score them a lot of times, and, I took her to picture the homeless. I took her once. The idea was for me to take students to these organizations 3 times. When I got ready to take her a second time, she said to me, Rob, I've already been back there 2 times already. And she found a way to work with this group. Manoa is now, you can look up this organization, Unlock NYC. She started an organization by creating an app for people that were facing injustice with vouchers. They were facing housing discrimination, and you can plug your information into an app. And she is one of the co-founders of Unlock NYC. And she goes by the acronym of Rob's baby sister. That's my heart and soul.
Okay, so we have quite a few hands up. So I think we can collect 3 questions at a time and then have the answers. Yeah. Right.
Hey there, thank you for all being here and sharing your stories and experiences, educating us all. So something that I noticed, and I'm sure many of us noticed around places like Bed-Stuy, Northern Crown Heights, Bushwick, you see signs posted up on the walls saying, "We'll buy your home for cash. We'll buy your cars for cash." There's a phone number. Can you just explain about what that means for those who don't know, and maybe how cease and desist letters apply to this?
Sorry. Next question. Okay, I guess we can answer this one, please. Next one.
Sure. Okay, so for me, as an organizer, I've always been against what I call cash for keys, right? I understand why a poor family who was struggling to make ends meet might see, and I just use a number, I'm not saying that, anybody's selling their house for $5,000 or $10,000, but sometimes people get enamored by that much money. They haven't seen that kind of cash and think it's a good idea, but you're eroding any possibility of building any kind of stability, because when you take that $10,000 and you try to find housing elsewhere, you're gonna find it doesn't go very far. right? So that was a big thing post foreclosure crisis, not only here in New York, but across the country, right? But we had to talk people out of that, but it's hard when people are struggling and don't have a lot of money, and all of a sudden somebody's in their ear with this, right? So we did a lot of organizing to push back against that. You're right, those signs are still going up, and same thing with cars, any way they can, right? To sort of flip, and take advantage of poor people, right? That's what it amounts to. But that's part of the popular and political education that we need to do as organizers, and that's work that just goes on every single day.
Yeah, just to briefly add to that, someone during the break came up and was asking us about some of the headlines that we've been seeing. It's actually quite difficult to find good information about this, but of like private equity funds and other investment vehicles making mass purchases of actually often single family housing, particularly distressed assets. You see this again on sort of it's all the same map. I mean, like where you find this is often in the places that were hit hardest by the financial crisis and mortgage foreclosures. And I do just want to note that one of the reasons why this is such a threat is because their pockets are so unbelievably deep. Like it's actually kind of hard to imagine. And in a world where housing is a commodity, then the ability to come through with these deep pockets and make cash offers that from the perspective of the fund or the of the owners of that accumulated capital is pennies, but to families who are struggling is potentially life-changing money. It just fuels these cycles, and so this is all just in agreement, but noting that one of the reasons why so many families are facing this really impossible decision from their perspective is because of the commodification of housing as an asset that gives holders of capital this tremendous power.
Yeah, just before we go to that question, I'll just add on top of that, I think there is some education going on about this outside of the US. So former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, Leilani Farha, during her mission, chased after Blackstone. She saw Blackstone as one of the big contributors to this problem in her lifetime. And she got together with 6 other rapporteurs to write strongly worded letters to several governments around the world saying, you're allowing this to happen, you're putting people's lives in peril. I thought it was very strong. She challenged Steve Schwarzman, the executive director of Blackstone. She also thought she was going to meet with him. And the day she was supposed to meet with him, they canceled the meeting because they didn't, press was downstairs and all that. I think, learning from people like that, we have to understand the financialization of housing, which we don't too well. And after the foreclosure, or during the foreclosure crisis, our federal government was complicit in it anyway. So at one point, there were 250,000 foreclosed homes that the government put in possibility of somebody acquiring. And they didn't do a real request for proposal. They basically took whatever Blackstone was offering them. And we got a lead from a group, and a website called credit.com. There was a young lady who worked for UHAD at the time, Dina Levy. I don't know if you remember her. Well, Dina was the one, she had a friend who wrote for this website, and he was getting bored, writing about all of these capitalist excursions. And he said, I want to really cause some trouble. So can you feed this to somebody? And we ended up with it in our hands to take back the land, and we sent it around the country. And then a lot of focus started going towards Blackstone, and it got as far as Spain. So LPE, the group in Spain, comes over here regularly to protest Blackstone. And at one time they took the Illuminator, which Occupy had very strong, and they changed the name of Blackstone Equity Partners to Blackstone Vulture Capitalists, and was shining on the building for like 2 straight nights. It was incredible. Question?
Just thank you so much for everything so far. This is gonna sound kind of like two questions, but it doesn't have to be, it can be one big question. So just thinking about CLTs, the community land trust model, and, challenges internally and externally to scaling this, the model. Not that anyone says that's all there should be, but, so one would be finance. I don't know to the extent like just funding, but also just financing and the way that we currently finance housing, and how does the community land trust model run up against that, and does that cause challenges for the groups currently doing it, or the imagination of it at scale? And then internally for the individuals who live in community land trust housing, you mentioned, Brian, that basically our social policy has been geared towards homeownership as a security measure, as well as security measures. So the lack of appreciation, like as you divorce wealth from ownership, which I think is good, but it doesn't matter what I think. How does that impact people's overall security? So it's all one topic. Thank you. So do we pass it?
One more question. Take that.
Question about transit in particular. How does it figure into the demands that you make? Do you make demands for free transit lines in some cases? Do you make demands for certain lines to be extended? I'm curious in particular what you think of the IBX proposal that would go from Bay Ridge to Jackson Heights, and other transit proposals like that. As opposed to like improving the existing service. How does that fit in? Because if you live somewhere but you have no access to other places, that seems like a major issue.
So,
Sorry, one more question.
sure.
Thanks so much for coming tonight. I just have a brief question about artificial vacancy as well, and artificial restriction of housing supply. How is organizing targeting specifically the sort of restriction of housing supply when it's something that it's sort of a moving target, and the actual data on how much what the supply of housing, how it's restricted, is sort of unknown specifically?
So I think it's known, but I think, again, developers have a lot of power, and these new buildings are being packaged in what is called REITs, Real Estate Investment Trust, and guaranteeing return on investment to investors. There's many vacant spaces around the city in luxury buildings because somebody invested in them. We use the term the new safe deposit box. So some investor from Japan or somewhere invest in, a 3-room condominium on 57th Street with the hope that down the road you can sell it for a big profit. I do think social justice groups are aware of it. Going back to like before 2010, the Right to the City Alliance had done a count of vacant spaces and was pushing the city to turn this into affordable housing, give access to people in shelters. Picture the Homeless, the organization that I started with, twice did vacant building counts around the city. I think in 2006, banking on vacancy, or 2011, there were 2 reports that came out, one in 2006, one in 2011. And both of them is where folks went around the city and counted these vacant spaces. So there's an awareness, and there was anti-warehousing legislation that was pushed forward a couple of times to force the city to find landlords who keep spaces vacant. I live in Harlem right now, and I think the gentrification, the rezoning of East Harlem is perfect proof of what happens. People get excited and they force mom and pop stores out of business by raising the rent, quadruple times because they want to make their money, and some of those stores sit empty. If you go up Lexington and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan right now, there's a lot of vacant space there because people are looking to, catch their windfall, but they can't deal with the big money that's coming in here and building these luxury towers. So there is education going around it, but I think it goes back to political will and getting the right people into office to pass the necessary legislation to push back on it. Transit-oriented development, I do think there's a lot of that going around. the city. I do think that that line that they're talking about in Queens is important. There was a deal that was just made recently to extend some commuter lines in the Bronx, right? Because if you want to come from certain sections of the Bronx and you're working in Midtown Manhattan, you got to commute. I used to live in the Bronx, and I was working at Partners for Dignity and Rights at the time in the financial district. I was a fucking hour and a half commute, man, on the 2 train. And I was like, yo, and then like going home, sometimes I fall asleep and I end up all the way up, upper Bronx, so you spend like 3 hours on the train. But if you had, the commuter lines in there, you could get into Midtown Manhattan a lot. So I do think there's some organizing going on around that. With respect to CLTs, I'll give you a little bit of the history. The struggle with Cooper Square, you had to force an agreement with the government, the New York City government, to get the funds to rehab some of these buildings. And that's what that fight was about. That was the big part of that fight, right? We used to have community development corporations, and Raúl might know this a little bit better than I had. I think a lot of them fell off the map because they just couldn't sustain, the fight against big developers, right? So once in the 60s, they started with the Community Development Corporation. Some of them had great ideas. They would build housing, build affordable housing. But if you build a CLT, or if you get the land, and let's just say there's nothing on that land, you can construct cooperative housing or mutual housing that, let's just say you built 40 units of 3.5 room apartments, right? They sell for $100,000 each. It remains truly affordable because the agreement that you made with the governance of that land is you can't sell it for more than $100,000. It's not about profit. You can only get out what you put in, so it remains truly affordable. And communities are in control in the governance of that land. But it's hard. And I think the East Harlem El Barrio Land Trust is finding that out. They were given some buildings in East Harlem that were in pretty bad shape. And they're finding that's a struggle. And there's also tension inside with some of the tenants who live there a long time and some of the newer tenants coming in. So it's not an easy thing to do. There are a lot of nuances through this whole thing, which is why I sort of early on said, there's some challenges. Conditions are different than they were 40, 50 years ago when Cooper Square was put together.
So I'll respond to the first two. On transit and transit-oriented housing, I mentioned how I came to this work and the study of local government law, and it was through thinking about fines and fees that local governments assess and collect, and sort of our goal primarily through policing was sort of the focus of that work. But one of the insights that I and the other organizers shared was that this is really a universal problem, and sort of one of the changes that we were talking about at kind of like a high abstract level was sort of public goods becoming consumer goods, essentially. And instead of relying on collective wealth and funding and providing goods free at the point of use, they were becoming more, local governments in particular, were becoming more reliant on fines and on fees, and also in the criminal space, fines as well. And so I've written about just a little bit about the proposals like Michelle Wu's in Boston and others around the world to make public transit and other public goods free at the point of use, and to change the funding model such that it's less individual flat fee, and instead that we are taxing wealth both where it exists and also progressive taxation of wealth. And I would just note, that is the model that we have for some transit. That is the model that we have for our roads, and for when you get in a car, you don't have to pay, for most roads. And so this is not unheard of, but it is kind of not unheard of, but it is an idea that's not intuitive to people in the public transit context. They're so used to this consumer model. And so I think it involves, it requires some political imagination. But I also want to note, again, kind of returning to some of the original points, it's not just a matter of political imagination or even political will. Our law has structured, it creates these structures that make it actually incredibly difficult to do that, even if you have the will. And so, for example, it is very expensive to run a, public transportation in New York City or anywhere. And so, when I say free, it's like free at the point of use. It still needs to be paid for. And local governments, because of the fragmentation of tax base and suburbanization and the constant threat of capital flight, have a very difficult time doing that, even for public goods that benefit everyone. And then, of course, just the point of it's directly connected to housing, because one of the reasons, one of the drivers of costs for public transit is density. And it is most financially feasible to locate transportation projects in dense housing areas. So one of the consequences of sprawl and suburbanization is to make public transit less financially feasible. And in New York, we can talk about all the problems with the subway system here, but in most of it's much better here than in most. I grew up in South Carolina, and it's just hard to imagine. It's not possible at all, really, to imagine anything like what we have here, and it's directly a consequence of not only political will but also patterns of housing and like spatial density. On CLTs, I'm going to defer to Rob's expertise. I would just note, sort of on the security point, the financial security point, and building assets. We haven't talked much about rent control, rent stabilization policies, but one way to think about the desirability from the individual's perspective of a 30-year mortgage is as a form of rent control. And just the stability that it provides people in knowing for the duration of the mortgage what their rent payment is, effectively the rent payment is going to be. And so that's, we don't have anything like, we provide rent control only for people who who take on debt to make private purchases of housing, mostly single family housing, and it's just not something that we do outside that context. So just wanted to note that.
I just want to, Brian mentioned fines and fees, and I want to just briefly bring to your attention a judge I met about 5 years ago at the University of Miami Law School as I was giving a lecture. Her name is Lisa Foster, and she left the judgeship to start the Fines and Fees Justice Center, because she said, as a judge, I don't appreciate what I'm being forced to do. Put these fines and fees on poor people. I just thought the lady was amazing. I spent about an hour sitting next to her and picked her brain, and still pick her brain to this day. But hearing Brian mention fines and fees, it just brought me up. And, I don't know if all of you know, so just quickly, I'll just read from the website. Lisa Foster is the co-founder and co-executive director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. She's a retired judge and the former director of the Office of Access to Justice at the United States Department of Justice. She left that position to start the Fines and Fees Justice Center. So when I was speaking next to her at the University of Miami, I'm like, Supreme Court Justice right here. She's a fancy.
Lisa's incredible, and the work of FFJC is amazing. One connection to housing that from FFJC's work and actually to New York. I love what the Fines and Fees I love their model for policy change. One of the issues that they got connected with and were advocating for was Governor Cuomo was pushing through a property tax break, and incredibly politically popular, particularly in the suburbs. And Fines and Fees Justice Center testified against this and pointed out that one of the consequences of starting local governments, when you slash property, again, I mentioned earlier that states very sharply restrict local government's ability to tax wealth, namely property wealth. And one of the consequences of those limitations that Governor Cuomo wanted to stricten or make more strict was that local governments have little choice but to turn to these very regressive revenue structures like fines and fees. And so Fines Fees Justice Center, Lisa, and others there made this connection. And I just find it a really inspiring model for change, and also sort of illustrating all of the ways that these problems, transit, criminalization, housing, are all connected.
Yeah, hi. So I just wanted to say also, as a person who is an old person and worked in a lot of different social movements, I'm very excited to hear what people are talking about here. And I just wanted to sort of emphasize, if I could, and I think especially the way Rob is talking, that working to be successful in social movements, you have to have the command of a lot of facts, like what ACT UP did, where you have to know the policy better. You have to know what should happen better. You will be dealing with people in government who don't understand things, so you do have to know them. But one of the ways you do it is, and you see, he's just this person, that law, and that law. So you don't have to know all of that. You have to focus on some area and really learn that narrow area better. But actually, the key to getting to it is not so much book learning, right? It's through people. So he can introduce you to these 45 people or whoever who actually want to know exactly every whole thing about it, and they've been thinking about it for 20 years. And you can talk to them or find a way to interact with them. And that's powerful. And then you have that energy, whatever. So I just feel excited about that, but it does take, like, I think a lot of times when we're in school, we just read everything about it in the book. And I'm not saying like book learning is good. I'm a big book learning person, but it actually, the power of social movements is people. And you can just go up to them and connect to them and be like, hi, I'm a person interested in this. And they will send you to the next person, the next person, the next person. And that's just a great way to go. And it's a lot more fun. So my question though was really, so what do you folks see from your vantage point as like the current state and the health and status of activism around housing? And I just love to hear like your take on where things are.
Anybody else?
Have a question?
Yeah, thanks. This is really engaging. I guess my question is slightly related to this person's. I wanted to know, how do you think that a lawyer or an advocate or person interested into going into law, there's probably a lot of them in this room, how can they spend their limited time and energy most effectively to try to achieve these goals of affordable housing? Housing is a human right. I kind of struggle in the debate in my mind between trying to address really serious issues that affect people on the ground, people that are living in extreme poverty in New York, versus kind of seeing the long view and fighting for policy change. So, what do you think?
So thank you. I think those are both great questions. I want to start out and say thank you for the compliment. I have this title in the community as a great collaborator. People tell me that I can connect you to people all over the world. And, I realize how blessed I am. I just recently went through a series of medical surgeries. I've had 4 surgeries since April. And one day I'm laying in Mount Sinai up on 102nd Street. And I get a phone call from a PhD student from Berkeley who is from Brazil. And she went to school here and got a master's degree here. And she calls me and she says, Rob, I heard you're in the hospital. I just wanted to wish you the best. We talked for about 20 minutes, right? And she says, word is getting around Brazil that you're in the hospital and, yada, yada, yada. I hang up and then I get a call in WhatsApp from Santi from La Paz, Spain, same type of thing. And I realize it's a blessing. Sometimes you make these connections, and I found that it is easy. And I used to tease a group that used to exist here in Brooklyn called Fury, Families United for Racial and Economic Equality. I get on the phone and I can't reach them. Then I just get on the train and go to Fury, and they said, Rob, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm going to answer the phone because I've been pulling all day and nobody's answering the phone. So I'm going to be here to answer the phone for you today. So I think those collaboration is important, right? And meeting people, as you say, I think that's an important part of this work. But I want to throw in this little caveat. I do think that I was able to do this work from a privileged position, which puts me in a lot better spaces. So I've had good problems for a good part of my life. So I survived a lot off the Social Security and disability. So I was getting a constant check coming in every month. I had steady income. I do speaking engagements with Neil students at these universities around the country and get good honorarium, right? So I had a way to sustain myself that other folks didn't. They had to work and they were tethered to an organization. So it allowed me to work freely. And I think that's a big deal, right? To be able to work in that fashion. I call it a privilege. People would look at me with a stink eye. What do you mean? You're African American, you're privileged? Yeah, I was privileged to be able to work out. I'm not tethered to an organization. The human rights organization that I work with, Kathy Albiza was the director when I went there, and I said, Kathy, I'll volunteer as long as you want me to, but you're not gonna hold my message. I'm gonna say what I wanna say and how I wanna say it. And we had that agreement, and, it still lasts, through the reiteration of Partners for Dignity and Rights, which it was called now. So I call that being able to do the work through a privilege point. I do think we are struggling a little bit with the state of housing because philanthropy divides us a lot in the city, right? And I think that's one of the big challenges that we have. How can we do this work without being dictated to by a philanthropic organization? So when you have to get a pot of money and then you have to write a report at the end of the work, that makes it a little bit difficult. And it makes you possessive of the work. Well, I'm not gonna work with Brian because, I'm doing this project and Brian might interfere with my funding. Well, that's crazy. And I learned that several years ago when a PhD student, David Skeller, came here from Berlin for a summit. And he called us to 16 Beaver Street, which was the space that George Copensis and Sylvia Federici used to lend to the social justice movement. And David Skeller pulled all the housing, many housing movements as he could, to come to 16 Beaver that night and just proceeded to rip us all a new ass. He said, I've worked with all of you, but none of you work with one another. That's a problem. And I was sitting in the back of the room clapping. Everybody was looking at me. I was like, yeah, I recognized that for years, right? So I think that's one of our main obstacles. How can we do this work better without such an over-reliance on philanthropy or philanthropy dictating to us how we do the work? And I think that makes it a little bit challenging. With respect to, I speak to a lot of law schools. I have been to Harvard, Northeastern, Northwestern, University of Miami. I'm down there twice a year, every year, speaking to students there. And in Berkeley Law School out in California, American in DC. I always say to the students, Duke University is among them also. So you're starting to see, in my opinion, young folks who are coming into law schools that say, I want to make social change. This world is unjust. I'm not going to end up making the six-figure salary that everybody told me I'm going to make, and my life is going to be so secure, right? I live in a neighborhood and I see people struggling. So how can I take my degree and put it back into the community? I would say do your best to work with the social justice organization, try to understand their problems and fit it into the context of the law. I will be speaking on December 12th at Ford Foundation with the South African Law Center, because they recognize me as one of the few people in the United States who speaks about human rights and speaks of criminal law. So they're doing a thing on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I've also worked with SERI, the Socio-Economic Rights Initiative in South Africa. So working with these types of groups, I think, is important. There is a young lawyer in the city right now who she used to work for Bronx Defenders. Her name is Sia Hedge, who I had the pleasure of meeting on a phone call with the UN Rapporteur back in August of 2020. As he was trying to figure out how he can support different communities around the world during a pandemic. And so Sia and I connected. She started chatting me up because she saw me have a one-on-one with Krishnan Rajagopal, who is the UN Rapporteur on housing right now. And she started asking me a lot of questions. We met for lunch later, and she says, Rob, I love what I do at Bronx Defenders, right? But it's not fulfilling enough. I want to do impact litigation. And so I reached out to some of my friends, Jamil Dakwa, who runs the Human Rights Program at the ACLU nationwide, and Eric Toss, who worked for the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. I said, I need a favor from you guys. There's a young lawyer that wants to see social change. You guys know this. I need you to coach her. Well, she is now working with the National Law Center on homelessness and poverty. And we have a human rights group working in New York, the Human Right to Housing Group, which she is organizing here in New York. So I think the best thing to do is connect with the social justice group, try to understand their problems, and then figure out what you can do to support their work, right, from a legal perspective. Because as much as social justice groups push back on me, and I used to say this, the picture of homeless all the time, when I was told you can't work with lawyers, and you can't work with these, you gotta write shit in legalese. I don't understand that shit. So I need to build a relationship with lawyers, right? I don't understand that shit. What I do understand is how to do direct action in civil disobedience. My ass is gonna be in the street taking over something, right? But then I need you to come get me out of jail, I need you to write a policy brief that is in a certain language that I understand. So the relationship between community and the legal community, I think, is important. And we have to build links rather than, draw lines of demarcation, separations.
I actually did some learning for Picture of the Homeless, so it's good to know how they felt now at this point. I just wanted to say real quick that if you are an undergrad thinking about going into law and legal services, but perhaps especially with respect to housing, I wouldn't worry about this question too much because it's not going to be your choice, right? You're going to get to a legal services organization that is underwater, especially in New York, and they will do their best to manage a balance between trying to solve things upstream, so to speak, with policy, and doing the work to help people who are in immediate acute pain, right? So you can, there maybe is a difference between like going to a think tank as a lawyer or just doing policy work, but if you are actually talking about any element of having clients, you're going to be talking about being at the intersection of organizing the courts and policy necessarily, because as we've learned today, it's a multi-front fight.
I would agree with you. I think that's what Sia's issue was, right? So she confided in me. I can help this one family in housing court. It's not impactful. I want to do impact litigation, right? And I think that's thinking outside of the box. So I certainly agree. And, I work with legal services a lot, and they're varied, right? They do the best they can, but, you're going to be assigned to do a certain task, and that's it.
So, some quick reflections, not limited to housing, but on this question, which is really important. So I have practiced as a lawyer. I'm now an academic, and I made that shift after thinking about it a lot. And I can tell you a little bit about sort of some of the things that I was thinking about. But I do just want to note I was a lawyer, but I was not a housing lawyer. And we have housing lawyers in the room, people who are protecting people from eviction. And it is, I have been to housing board and done observations, and it is, most people are underrepresented in these processes. So they don't have, they don't have legal protection or advice. And what's incredible with the law in this particular context, but maybe more broadly, is that it is in some ways sort of a superpower. And, and you say a magic word like cockroach or rat or something, and then all of a sudden legal protections kick in, and this person is still in their home, and if they didn't know to say that word, then like that would not be the case. And so it is, even if that is just like representing one family, it is this like incredibly powerful tool. But there's also lots of different ways to use the law. There's impact litigation, direct representation, all of the, people are facing all sorts of different problems. So even if you're not working on housing, you're working next to housing advocates. I thought about this a lot. And in some ways right now, it feels, I will be honest, sometimes I feel a little bit, self-indulgent that like my job is to sit in front of my computer and like read and write. And, when I was a lawyer, there were a lot of frustrations, but at the end of the day, it was like, we would say, here are these various problems. we think that they are a violation of the law. And then at the end of the process, someone would say like, we agree or not. And if they agreed, then someone's lives or maybe a class of people's lives would change immediately, or maybe not immediately, but would change. And, but on the other hand, one sort of challenge in the litigation space is that you are working within a system. And I think one of the frustrations that I faced was that a lot of the things that I was working on were actually perfectly legal. They were legal and they were deeply unjust, but the system was set up in a way that like it was very difficult to use litigation to challenge these structures. And so I wanted to work on kind of imagining a different world. And, you know, that ended up taking me into academic work, which I struggled with a little bit because I was at the time sort of asking myself this question, like, how can I be most impactful? And I think that I, over time, sort of started asking a different question, which is, I knew what the struggle was that I wanted to be a part of. And I asked, like, what am I best at? Like, what is sort of like, you know, and so for me, that was like writing, and, you know, other things that are now part of my job, but for others in the room, it might be data analysis and using maps, or it might be litigation, it might be connecting people, and so, like, it's, you know, and this is also kind of just affirming what Raúl was saying, is sort of like, you can think about this, but also like, in some ways, kind of it answers itself. Either, you know, you show up and you're put to work, or just like over time you kind of realize like, I have this superpower, and I know what struggle I want to be a part of, let me put myself to work. On the state of housing advocacy, so two quick things that, you know, ongoing, or three, I guess, ongoing projects that I'm excited about. One is thinking about how to use the power of the power of the city, to directly intervene in the supply, supply of affordable housing, and address the access crisis, excuse me, which is directly related to the affordability crisis. And that can take a lot of different forms, but there has been a lot of work now that's sort of emerging in the sort of under the broad umbrella of like a fight for housing guarantee. And there are a number of different initiatives that are kind of under that. Raúl has done a lot of work on jobs guarantee, and this is sort of like a kind of a complement to that way of thinking about and sort of, you know, imagining a different politics. And then there's important work around kind of ensuring that all neighborhoods and all cities are contributing to addressing the affordability crisis. And so taking on problems like exclusionary zoning, and local governments rejecting public housing and affordable housing. And then the third, I've mentioned it a number of times, but I do find the work of local community land trusts, include here in New York, not just to be thinking not just about sort of like community, like CLTs as the model, but again, in sort of like connecting their fight to abolition and to other related crises. And I just find that very exciting. So those are three specific examples.
So we are out of time, but if anybody has like one last question, otherwise I just thank Rob, Brian, and Raúl for this absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for coming to doing this. We hope to continue this series next semester, once a month. So, you know, we'll email you with the more details next semester. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. This was great.
Thanks so much. I don't work in I thought they have not, but that's the thing about it.
Yeah, I just, I work both out of.
She is their president. She is a fantastic human being. She grew up in New York City. I worked friendly from, you know, like, I just, I think she won't say she's my sister, but she likes so, and we're like, but I think she's just I mean,
I mean,
like, used to be your first.
um,